Well, again, thank you all for coming. It's great to see this wonderful turnout, and I appreciate everyone being here. So I'm going to split this talk into three parts. So one is about Mongabay, where it came from, the origin. Second part is how journalism can lead to impact. And the third part is about some trends in the journalism industry, which are a little bit depressing, but I think it will end on a high note, hopefully. So I don't want to bum everyone out. So just very briefly, what is Mongabay? So Mongabay is an international journalism outlet that covers issues at the intersection of nature and people in impact geographies. So that means geographies where you feel like journalism can have impact. And I'll get into that a little bit later. We're structured around 6 regional bureaus in 6 languages. So that's global English, Indonesian, Spanish for Latin America, Portuguese for Brazil, Hindi and English in India, and French, which is really targeting West and Central Africa. We have about 90 staff. We'll be around 100 by the end of the year. And then we have about 1,000 contributing journalists in about 70 countries. We produce content, so written content, video content, like especially short form video, and audio, so podcasts. Our business models were a nonprofit, so we primarily get grants from foundations and then donations from individuals. And distribution, we have people coming to our website, social media, and then we give away all our content for free, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So that means that there are a lot of media outlets that republish our stories. So the first thing people usually ask me after why I'm named Rhett Butler is that's another story you can tell my parents. Is why did I start Mongabay? So I had the great fortune of having a mother who's here, who was a travel agent, and a father who traveled a lot for business. And I always loved reptiles and amphibians. And when I look in books, the most interesting reptiles and amphibians were in the rainforest. So I had a special interest in rainforests growing up. And thanks to my mother being a travel agent, we would go to more exotic places than the average people. So places like Venezuela. And then I finally had an opportunity to go to the real rainforest for the first time when I was 12. We went to Eastern Ecuador, right near one of the most biodiverse places on earth, Yasuni National Park. And we had a great time in this forest. Went and looked for frogs, saw all sorts of interesting creatures. We came back, and a few months later, there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle about an oil spill that happened on this Rio Napo upper Right Bend. And so what that meant is that whole area was then coated in oil. And so I wondered what had happened to the people that I met and the animals in the forest. And so that's what moved me from being someone who liked cool frogs to really following environmental issues very closely. The thing that actually moved me to action happened in high school. So I had an opportunity to go to Malaysian Borneo, which is the most biodiverse part of Borneo. Beautiful forests like this. It's full of all sorts of amazing animals, including cool lizards. So really beautiful forest. I kept in correspondence with the scientists there. And several months after I left, the forest nearby was pulped to make paper, and now it's an oil palm plantation. And so when that forest was destroyed, and it went from looking like you just saw it to something like this, I decided I wanted to raise awareness about what was happening in tropical forests. So when I started in college, I began writing a book about rainforests. So my major was management science economics, which is math, finance, and econ. But I worked on this project on the side, and I was able to get some independent study credit. And then thanks to taking AP classes at Menlo Atherton High School just down the street here, I was able to graduate a year early. And so I spent that extra year working on this book. I found a publisher, went through peer reviews. The publisher came back and said, we'd like to publish this book, but we don't have the budget to put pictures in it. So there may be some grayscale images, but this is going to be basically a textbook. And to me, that really defeated the purpose of what it's trying to do, which is convey the beauty of rainforests and why we should save them. So I decided to put the book up on the internet so we could read it for free. And I decided to name it after this island off Madagascar. So this island, it has a different name, but I anglicized it. So it'd be really easy to see who is talking about, my website. So if you type Mongabay into Alta Vista or Excite, the only thing that would come up would be references to my website because it's a totally made up name. The reason I chose Nosy Mongabay as sort of the inspiration for this is it's an island covered with rainforest, surrounded by coral reefs, and it's home to all sorts of amazing animals, including great frogs and lizards. But the reality was I wasn't going to run a website for a living, so I came back home and started working for a small Silicon Valley company. But in nights and weekends, I kept working on Mongabay, and it started to grow popular. And then in mid-2003, I decided to put ads on the site. And because the site was popular, it started to generate revenue. And so within about 6 months of putting ads on the site, the revenue generated was about equal to about half my take-home pay. So I decided to quit my job and pursue my passion. And the first thing I did was create a section for children that I had adapted into 48 languages by native speakers. It was about rainforests. The other thing that I did is I started to take pictures wherever I traveled, because I never wanted to have an issue of not having a photo for the website again. So I've now posted around 200,000 photos on the site. And I created this new service. And so this is what Mongabay is most known for now. People didn't really know that it was just really me in my pajamas in my apartment writing articles for the first several years. But because I wrote so much and kind of was filling a niche, which was sort of between advocacy content that was coming out from NGOs and sort of mainstream media, which just didn't really cover these issues as much. I mean, they would do good stories, but they were stories that were few and far between. So there was like a lot of hunger for this content. And so, we continued to build readership. But as time went on, I had all these ideas I wanted to pursue that there was no business model for, or at least no advertising business model for. For example, I thought that Indonesia was at a really interesting point in its development cycle. So one of the big issues in Indonesia is a lot of environmental degradation is driven by corruption in the natural resources sector, corruption and mismanagement. And so journalism is an intervention that could actually help make a difference, because it could increase transparency and therefore accountability around natural resources management. And I thought, well, journalism is actually something that can help move the needle. There's not really much good environmental coverage in Indonesian language across Indonesia. It tends to be very hyper-localized. So I decided to form a nonprofit in order to pursue this idea. So in 2012, I formed the nonprofit. I applied for grants. I got one from the Ford Foundation. As soon as I got the grant, I announced that I was hiring for this new thing called Mongabay Indonesia. And I don't speak any Indonesian. So, obviously I was going to have a very small role in this, but I, put out this announcement. And because there were so many people in Indonesia already reading the English language of Mongabay, I got just a deluge of people applying for these roles. And so I went over to Indonesia, hired a team. Within a month, we launched the website. And a month after that, it was the most popular Indonesian language environmental news service in the country. So took off really quickly. The president of Indonesia was referencing the site within 3 months. So it was really exciting. Indonesia was also really interesting from the standpoint that social media adoption was much higher there than in other markets. So it was a place where we could kind of test ideas and see what was working there, because the rest of the world was eventually going to catch up to Indonesia on social media and some of these other things. So we also developed this model of having local correspondents across the country, which we eventually brought back to Mongabay Global. So in 2015, I donated all the Mongabay news content to the nonprofit and moved all operations over to the nonprofit. 2016, we launched in Spanish for Latin America. 2018, we launched in India, first English, then Hindi. And we're about to launch Mongabay Africa, which is bilingual, French and English. The reason it's French and English is we're really targeting key decision makers in certain countries. And in those countries, those decision makers tend to speak one of those 2 languages. We also have 2 kind of sub-bureaus, which we have aspirations to turn to bureaus in the near future, including Mongabay Brazil. So if we look at our growth, it's like this over, since we formed the nonprofit. And again, we'll probably be around 100 by the end of this year. And so this is our staff plus our correspondents. So you can see that we are primarily not in Europe, the United States. We're primarily kind of at as we say, at nature's front line. So we have a big presence in Asia and also Latin America. We're not quite as strong in Africa, but once we launch the bureau, we expect that to grow quite a lot. So journalism and impact. So, as I mentioned, so Mongabay used to be based on an advertising model, which means you want to monetize your reader. So it's about essentially selling page views or traffic. When we switched to a nonprofit, it totally changed the equation. We don't really care about traffic anymore. We really care about reaching critical key audiences that tend to be decision makers. So people who actually, by informing them, they'll make decisions that can have positive impacts in the world. So it's a very different model. It means that we give away our content for free. We're no longer worried about page views on our side. If people are reading our content in other places or adaptations of our content, that's going to drive us towards some of our goals, which are really, driving this impact. So how does journalism drive impact? So, most basically it raises awareness. So that's both among the general public, but also among key target audiences. So for us, that is people who work in the agencies that manage natural resources. So Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of Fisheries. It's people in the overseas development agencies that control or influence a lot of the money that goes into conservation globally. It's other journalists. It's people who work in conservation, people who work in advocacy organizations. It's people who are in the private sector who are managing commodity supply chains or making decisions around investments. So we have kind of these very specific target groups that we're aiming for, but in order to sort of cut through those silos, we write in a general interest style. And so with that general interest style, we end up reaching a much larger audience. So we have typically 3 to 4 million people coming to our website every month. Another way journalism can drive impact is by increasing transparency and accountability. Again, that's the basic concept of what we did with Mongabay Indonesia and why I started it. But again, we're not an advocacy organization. We're using journalism as our our instrument for driving change. You can end up having advocacy outcomes by being very targeted. So, for example, if there's a mayor who's allowing illegal logging in, say, a national park in Peru, by focusing a spotlight on that person, it can then lead to public prosecutor removing that person from office or something else. So you can get very specific intervention or very specific outcomes from sort of very targeted journalism. Journalism can also foster an enabling environment for a wide range of actors. So one of the things we found that's been really interesting is in some places where you don't have freedom of the press, like Malaysia, the press will not cover certain issues. But if Mongabay is a story, then local media can then blame Mongabay and say, Mongabay says this, and then they can build off it. So it basically provides like a cover for local journalists and local outlets to then do that reporting that they couldn't do otherwise. So we become sort of a vehicle for all sorts of other actors. And I'll get into an example of that in a minute. Another thing that journalists can do is identify gaps and opportunities. So this is one reason why some of our donors work with us, is they may be supporting, say, elephant conservation, and they're supporting elephant conservation groups. But by having journalists go out and do this reporting, it brings back a lot of other interesting information. So there may be like local communities that are doing good work, or NGOs are kind of under the radar, or there may be an obstacle that's sort of holding back success in elephant conservation. So again, identifying these gaps and opportunities is something that's quite valuable from a journalism standpoint. And then journalism can also inspire ideas and action. So we've seen this, time and again, where we'll do reporting on like a local group that has like a forestry project that's protecting their forest. Then other local communities will read that and they'll replicate the idea. So that's really, how you get to scale with some of these ideas is by having, them surfaced in the media and then other groups learning from it and replicating it. And so, it's kind of the impact tracking is kind of hard. So how do we actually know what impact that we're contributing to? So we've actually built an entire system internally, which looks at both the quantitative impacts and the qualitative impacts. So we're not attributing all the impact to our work, but we can say that we did this reporting and then things happened afterwards. And so sometimes we may have interesting evidence, like we may know that a certain person read the story because they communicated with after, or they made a statement. And so we can, say that, okay, well, Mongabay definitely had a contribution here. Other times it's much more serendipitous. But what we've done is we've built this system that looks at both, the quantitative stuff, so, production, readership, syndication, social media activity, but then the qualitative, which I think is much more interesting. But it's things like use and decision making of our articles, policy change. So like a company adopting a zero deforestation commitment after we do a story, shifts in funding, and then, again, replication of ideas. So this is my favorite example, probably. Some of you probably heard it before, but it's about United Cacao, which was a company operating in Peru. So back in 2014, it was the end of the last commodity super cycle. So that meant that most commodity prices were declining. The one exception to that was cacao. And so this company went public in London, and it was the only pure play cacao company in London. And so there's a lot of investor excitement about it. And they had this really good story where they were working with indigenous people and restoring the rainforest and all this other wonderful stuff. So I wasn't aware of any of that. We were using this platform called Global Forest Watch to monitor, which uses data from all different sources, but especially from satellites, to track change in forest cover. And we saw these pink polygons popping up in the Western Peruvian Amazon, which again is one of the most biodiverse parts of the Amazon. And so we decided to send a reporter to dig into this. And it turned out that this company was actually clearing this forest. So it was misleading investors and the public about its activity. It was, clearing, they said they were, just planning on degraded land, but this was actually primary forest that was very biodiverse. The way we knew that is there were scientists who had done really great work, including a friend of mine, Greg Asner, who had flown over this area with an airplane that has advanced sensors, so that he mapped all the biodiversity, the carbon value, so we could see what was there before, and then we could see what was there after, by virtue of the satellite imagery. And so we had a journalist go and investigate on the ground, visit the site, and so it was very clear what was happening. And so we were preparing to come out with a story. We reached out to United Cacao for comment. We didn't hear back from United Cacao. But we heard back from a top 5 U.S. law firm telling us they were going to sue us out of existence if we published the story. And so I thanked them for their letter, and I said, you don't have libel or slander because we have all this data that supports everything we're writing. We asked United Cacao for comment, and it doesn't seem like they have comments, so we're proceeding with the story. So the law firm ended up dropping United Cacao as a client. Well, I also reminded the law firm that I had looked at their corporate social responsibility policy, and that representing this firm, this company violated that policy, and they had also championed themselves as being a free speech law firm, and so kind of undermined their foundational principles. So again, that didn't really matter to me because we were just going to publish the story anyway. So we moved forward with the story. And it was kind of the first major international press around the issue. So it got a lot of attention. So NGOs started to do campaigns around it. Other outlets started to do stories and reporting off it. And it turned out there was all sorts of other stuff going on. Eventually, the Peruvian government revoked the company's operating permit. And that led to the company being delisted from the London Stock Exchange. And so the reason that was important, so if you look at the high resolution imagery, you can clearly see that there are trees that are down on the ground. So in terms of why that was important is the company had been planning to raise additional capital in the markets in order to clear another nearly 100,000 hectares, so nearly 250,000 acres of forest for oil palm and cacao plantations. So that's about the size. That's about 16 times the size of Manhattan. If you want to convert that into sort of climate impact, it's almost 29 million tons of CO2 emissions avoided, which is driving a car 72 billion miles. So again, Mongabay didn't drive this impact, but we helped contribute to it. There were all sorts of other actors in the space that that made this possible, but it just shows a way that journalism can contribute to a real world impact. So this is the a little bit depressing part of the talk. So talking about some of the trends in journalism. So one of the things that probably most people are aware of is the shifting business models in the space have been really hard on journalism outlets. So there's just been a lot of bankruptcies, layoffs in the sector. So, even National Geographic laid off all their staff writers a few months ago. And so this is a byproduct of various trends, but one of the newer trends is that interest in news consumption is collapsing. So this has really accelerated since the pandemic, but this just shows, so it's hard to read, but several countries, but the top is showing countries where the decline is most significant in recent years. And then the countries with stable levels are also declining. So that's not a good sign of state if it's considered, if a 22% decline or percentage point decline, so that's like a 30% decline, actual, percentage decline, if that's considered good. So this is a global trend. And it's also happening across social media. So, I mean, TikTok's the exception, but almost without exception, besides TikTok, there's this decline in news consumption. So there's a large percentage of the population, around 40% of people globally, who are actively avoiding news now. There's all sorts of reasons for it. I mean, the news can be very depressing. People don't believe journalists anymore. All sorts of reasons. Another challenging trend is the degradation of the information ecosystem. So there's been this proliferation of news sources that are, very diverse and fragmented. And not everyone has a good understanding of what's accurate or not accurate. And so it used to be there were just a few outlets that most people consume. Now there's just like a tsunami of different outlets of varying quality. Another challenge is that algorithms increasingly decide who sees what content. So this can be very challenging for news outlets. It's no longer human curation, it's algorithmically driven. So then the rise of fake news is another issue. So people don't know how to distinguish between what's real and not real. And so I think that's a problem. I think AI is going to make it worse. We're going to be swamped in a sea of sort of garbage content, I would say. But I think a bigger problem is I think a lot of people don't care. I think a lot of people just want to hear whatever sort of fits their worldview. And so that's a very challenging thing for sort of the news media world. Another challenge on the distribution front is a lot of news content is being banned. So Facebook has started banning news in certain or sharing of news links in a lot of countries. Elon Musk is not really a big fan of news. And the way you get distribution now on a lot of social media platforms is just by paying for distribution. So again, very challenging. And then consumer taste in sort of what platforms are using and how those platforms work is also rapidly evolving. So something that may have worked 6 months ago in terms of reaching your audience no longer works. So sort of continue on this not so happy theme. It's also challenging to be a journalist these days. So there's rising authoritarianism around the world. So this means shrinking press freedoms. Fake news is being used to sort of clamp down on journalists all over the world in all different ways. There's also increasing criminalization. So not so much in the U.S., but there was an interesting case a few months ago. But sort of these spurious raids and tax audits on news outlets, people getting arrested, the strategic litigation against public participation lawsuits, is challenging. There's also a lot of violence against journalists, as Holt mentioned at the beginning. It's also harder to get official comment from officials in many countries. And so it means that outlets that sort of toe the party line, they can get quotes from government officials, but outlets that are, I guess, more critical in their reporting have a really hard time getting information from official sources. And then, of course, there's a lot of surveillance and hacking of journalists, really around the world. That said, it's not all bad. I know I've just gone through a litany of bad things, but there are positive things in the journalism space. So one is that if you're reporting on environmental issues, the degree of environmental degradation around the world is finally reaching a point where it's affecting people personally. So this kind of reporting is now more relevant to more people. Again, it's not necessarily a great thing, but it is a reality of the world we live in today. Just like the number of news sources has expanded, the number of sources of data has proliferated. And so this is really valuable for an outlet like Mongabay, but really any news outlet, is you can get data from all these different places now. So it's much easier to get great data from satellites, for example. So we no longer have ignorance as an excuse in the world. Like, we can see what's happening. So that's great from a journalism perspective. There's also all sorts of document leaks. And then most importantly, like just the ability to analyze and distill information from this data. Because it's one thing to have kind of like a fire hose of data, but it's another thing to be able to distill it into actual information that can be used for journalism. There's also sort of the way that journalism works is evolving. So there's more types of collaboration, new types of partnerships. Again, when I started Mongabay News almost 20 years ago, it was really about advertising. So you didn't necessarily want to share your content. You wanted to, monetize your traffic. Now we're giving away our content for free, but we're also doing these joint investigations with other outlets. And so it's not just Mongabay. There's all sorts of outlets that are collaborating in new and different ways, which is, really important for the health of the space. There's also rising philanthropic interest in the journalism space, which I guess is also great for Mongabay, because that is part of our model now, but also subscription. So people are now willing to actually pay for content, which wasn't necessarily the case, say, 20 years ago. And then new tools. So there's just new ways to reach and engage people. And so bringing it back to Mongabay, so we're having to respond to all these trends, and it can be confusing and difficult, but I think we're doing okay so far. So one of the key things is shifting to a nonprofit model. So really, again, this focus on impact, the actual impact of our reporting rather than just page views. So really looking at the quality of engagement rather than the quantity of engagement. So we've decided to stop using certain platforms or stop prioritizing them because they drive traffic that doesn't actually lead to any impact. So it's kind of like empty traffic. So we decided we're not going to worry about that. We're really going to focus on the platforms where people are actively engaging. Another thing we're doing is, changing our distribution. So we're looking at new channels. So again, we're sort of constantly surveying the social media landscape and deciding where it makes sense to engage and where it makes sense to, automate things or deprioritize. As I mentioned, I think we have an Open Creative Commons license, which means anyone can use our content for free, commercially or non-commercially. We're also working with other platforms. So like I mentioned, Global Forest Watch. So Mongabay stories will actually show up on Global Forest Watch. This is a platform called Earth HQ, which is like a map of all the various issues that are happening in the world from an environmental standpoint. And Mongabay stories are geotagged and appear on that map. We're also doing new partnerships with data providers and other media outlets. We're expanding again into languages and geographies where we feel like our journalism can have an impact. So one of the questions I get often is, why isn't Mongabay working in China? Well, Mongabay really can't work in China because of the nature of the media landscape. So we do have a strategy for Chinese, but it doesn't involve having a presence in China. It's really focusing on diaspora. We're also making more investments in data-driven reporting, investigations, and frontline reporting. And then when we do some of these investigations, we end up with a lot of really interesting data. And so we're actually putting some of that data into platforms, which are basically decision support tools. So for example, like in the reforestation space, there's a lot of enthusiasm around tree planting, but there's also a lot of dodgy projects and outright fraud. And so trying to determine which projects are good and what you need to sort of think about when evaluating a project. There's not a lot of great disclosure around that. And so we built this platform for trying to increase knowledge of what's happening with these tree planting projects, and then help people identify, what projects are out there based on the criteria they're looking for. And so this news avoider issue is a big problem. We are working to navigate it. And I actually just came across this data a few weeks ago, but it's kind of interesting because Mongabay started scaling up about 5 years ago, our solutions journalism. So you can talk about, you can do journalism that just focuses on problems, but you can also do the same kind of journalism, but just reframe it as a solution. So here's a solution that's trying to address this problem. It does require reframing, but it's not greenwashing. It's just a different way of telling a story. But it's interesting, people who actively avoid the news, they are still interested in positive stories, solutions, and explainers. And so those just happen to be 3 areas that we've prioritized in the past few years. And so it's nice to see that this data validates that decision. But in terms of solution coverage, so a couple of the projects we're doing a lot more on is Indigenous-led conservation. So there's been a big shift in the conservation space over the past 5 years where Indigenous local communities have been put at the center of conservation rather than the top-down approaches. Also looking at conservation technologies. So how can we leverage technology to actually drive conservation outcomes? And then things like agroecology and regenerative agriculture is another area we've been doing a lot of reporting. Another thing that's that's interesting is who avoids the news and their political affiliation. So if you look at this, the second thing on that list is climate change and environment news. So 64% of people who identify as being on the right say they avoid that, who are news avoiders, avoid that type of content. So if you want to reach key decision makers who are on the right, there are other ways to do it by focusing on like either reframing the story or focusing on different aspects of, say, climate or environmental issues. So people who identify as being on the right, they're interested in security news, tech, science. So focusing on different aspects of these things may be a way to reach those audiences that may otherwise tune out to whatever you're trying to report on. The danger issue is indeed real and scary for journalists, especially frontline reporters. So we've prioritized safety for staff, contributors, and sources. So sources are often not really thought about, but when you go into a community and do this reporting and then leave, the journalist is not necessarily at risk. It's the people who provided that information who are at risk. And so you really need to think about what is the impact for this reporting on the people on the ground. And so that's something that we're trying to be much more intentional about with our reporting so we can be responsible. We're also trying to strengthen local capacity by offering more opportunities through fellowships and trainings. And then again, just to reemphasize, we're really putting a focus on engagement and impact, throughout the organization. So not just, in everything we do. So, what is the potential impact of this reporting that we're going to do? And so with that, I'll close just with this nice example from 2 years ago. So there was a company there was a community in Gabon that had been sort of protecting this ancestral forest for generations. And a Chinese logging company had been granted a concession in this, and so they were about to start logging in this forest. We had a local reporter go and do reporting on this issue, and it caught the eye of the Minister of Environment. And so he went to go visit this community. He had planned to be there for a few hours, but he ended up staying for 2 days. He came back and then revoked the permit for the company, and then recognized the community's conservation project. And it was the first community-based conservation project to win that sort of endorsement from the government. And so it was important in Gabon because conservation in Gabon had historically been very top-down. So this is the first bottom-up project. And so that was a case where we had direct sort of evidence of Mongabay's reporting leading to this outcome. So it was just a very positive story, and I think really illustrates the kind of impact that Mongabay's journalism can have, but also just journalism generally. That it's not just reporting on something that no one someone reads and then forgets about. It is something that can lead to real world impact.